Tonight, charges laid. 3 people in Fort St. John facing manslaughter charges. More cases. The measles continue to spread here in Northeast BC. And being held. Weather helps firefighters tackle the Summit Lake wildfire. Good evening and thank you very much for joining us. And we begin tonight with charges being laid in connection with a homicide in Fort St. John. Mounties saying 3 people are facing manslaughter charges after an assault turned fatal. It happened last Tuesday in the 9900 block of 99 Avenue. Police arrived at the scene to find an unresponsive victim who was pronounced dead at the scene. Online court records show Ethan Dorr and Dylan Kazes have both been charged with manslaughter. A third name has been redacted due to a publication ban. Investigators saying they believe this was an isolated incident and there's no threat to the public. And police in Fort St. John are thanking the public for their help in finding a missing person from Ontario. Mounties say Emma Kango McCabe paid a visit to a business in the energetic city on June the 24th. The day before, officers had found her vehicle in Fort St. John. The Ontario Provincial Police saying at the time they were very concerned about her well-being. Now police in Fort St. John saying the 25-year-old has been located and is safe and sound. Well, the BC Centre for Disease Control updating the total number of measles cases in the province. The Northern Health Region yet again seeing the biggest increase in cases across BC. The BC CDC confirming 10 new cases for the Northern Region since Friday, and that brings the total to 51 for Northern Health. The total number of cases across British Columbia now sits at 77. Well, the Summit Lake wildfire west of Fort Nelson is now being held. The BC Wildfire Service saying after almost 3 weeks of rain on and off, the blaze has mostly been reduced to a smoldering ground fire. Now, crews are now able to access steep terrain to get to the fire. Firefighters are continuing to secure the Highway 97 corridor. The fire has grown to almost 81,000 hectares in size. Starting Wednesday, cooler temperatures are expected to further help fight the fire. The blaze started back on May the 28th and is believed to be human-caused. Canada's first shipment of liquefied natural gas is being loaded onto a tanker in Kitimat and is set for export to Asia. LNG Canada is this country's biggest private sector investment in history. $40 billion has come from port operations on the west coast, gas fields here in Northeast BC, and the connecting pipeline. The project is a joint venture between Shell and 4 Asian partners. The first phase is expected to produce 14 million tons of LNG a year. And a BC company is attracting international investment for its cutting-edge technology tackling greenhouse gas emissions. It's pioneered a way to capture CO2 emissions in a way that's never been done before. But carbon capture is expensive, and the industry says it needs more private and public sector support to ramp up the industry. Mijan Lee has the story.
At the massive Savante factory in Burnaby, robotic arms are holding special filters that were years in the making. Material that the company says could be a game changer in the fight against climate change. And it all started in this engineer's garage 18 years ago.
The biggest culprit for climate change is actually CO2 going into the atmosphere.
Savante's team of 300 engineers and scientists have produced filters designed to trap carbon dioxide directly from industrial emissions and even from the air itself. The filters then go into this machine, a sort of carousel of carbon capture. This state-of-the-art machine is called the Buck. The idea is you build one next to a polluting smokestack, and the goal is that it would capture 95% of the CO2 emissions, which then get buried underground. The company got a shout out from the Premier recently on his trip to Korea, where he met with Samsung.
They partnered with a BC company called Savante around carbon capture technology. It was developed in British Columbia. It'll be deployed around the world.
The BC government and Ottawa are both banking on carbon capture to help them reach their climate goals. BC and the Canada Growth Fund have committed more than $140 million to Savante. Carbon capture has been around for decades, but has a history of under-delivering. 16 years ago, the BC government poured millions of dollars into studying carbon capture of the province's worst single carbon emitter at the time, Spectra Energy's natural gas plant in Fort Nelson. Despite high hopes, the province says it's been on pause for several years.
This was supposed to be the technology that, there would have been lots of these things around by now. It was what people thought by the 1990s. It simply hasn't worked.
This energy economist says that's partly because we've been chasing the wrong technology and
North American carbon pricing and other GHG regulations are just not strong enough, and it's just very politically fraught right now.
Savante wants to see more financial incentives from provincial and federal governments and private sector funding to ramp up the industry and get projects going now, and in turn, create high-paying Canadian jobs.
We can afford to do it. We figured out how to not have garbage in our front yard, and we figured out how to have a sewage system. We figured out how to deal with acid rain. I think this is another thing that we can figure out.
The province says carbon capture is essential for reducing emissions in large industry. The question is just how quickly it can happen, even with Canada unlikely to meet its emissions targets for 2030. Mi Jung Lee, CTV News, Burnaby.
The province is considering major changes that will impact the rights of people living in supportive housing. Housing Minister Ravi Kahlon has formed a working group which includes supportive housing providers, police, and staff from the province. Kahlon says there are some tenants who do not follow rules around building access, weapons, and smoking illicit drugs. So the group will look at removing supportive housing from the Residential Tenancy Act, which could see tenants lose some of the protections the Act provides. Kahlon wants the working group to report back to him in the early fall and plans to enact any suggested changes as soon as possible. Well, things are getting back to normal at the airport in Vancouver today after hundreds of flights were delayed or canceled over the weekend. NavCan says a number of unplanned absences of air traffic controllers played a part in combination with a very busy travel weekend ahead of Canada Day. If you are taking a flight this summer to Vancouver, you're being advised to check online ahead of time in case there are any disruptions. There have been a number of incidents like this at YVR in recent months with a shortage of air traffic controllers, blamed for the significant disruptions. This weekend, there were no flight delays in or out of Fort St. John. To Ottawa, where Pierre Poilievre will have to wait until later this summer before he can earn a chance to regain a seat in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister has called a by-election in the Alberta riding of Battle River Crowfoot on August the 18th. The by-election was triggered after Damien Keurig resigned to allow Poilievre to run in the riding, which is considered one of the safest Conservative seats across the country. This comes after Poilievre lost in Ottawa-Carleton, a riding he had held for 2 decades. Trade talks between Canada and the U.S. have resumed after Ottawa has decided to scrap a tax targeting tech giants. CTV's Michael Couture has more on the motive behind the move and the reaction from the White House.
Prime Minister Mark Carney says discussions between Canada and the U.S. restarted this morning after a call with President Donald Trump last night. But the way the Americans are framing it is very different.
It's very simple. Prime Minister Carney in Canada caved.
A blunt assessment of how it all played out from the White House. The two leaders spoke late last night, and then Canada announced it was rescinding the digital services tax. Carney said removing it was part of a bigger negotiation.
It doesn't make sense to collect tax from people and then remit them back. So it provides some certainty.
The DST was intended to collect tax from big tech companies that make money off Canadian users but don't pay Canadian taxes. Carney says the two sides will now work towards negotiating a full trade deal by July 21st.
The White House says you caved. Is that how it went down?
The Prime Minister wouldn't answer that, but the Canadian Chamber of Commerce applauds the move, pointing to the bigger picture negotiation.
$3.6 billion worth of trade crosses our border every single day with the United States. We can't afford to play with that. We need to make sure we secure that.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre believes Carney should have got something in return. Writing on X, in exchange, the Prime Minister should insist that the U.S. immediately rescind softwood lumber tariffs, adding, we need to make gains for our workers in these talks.
They forced the U.S.'s hand.
Michael Geist specializes in internet and e-commerce law. He says Canada needs smarter tech regulation than to just make web giants pay up.
We've too often looked at these companies as akin to almost like a policy ATM, where we're anxious to do withdrawals to help fund some of our policy objectives, but we haven't really factored in the costs associated with this and some of the potential negative consequences that might come about.
Now, rescinding the DST would require an act of Parliament, but the Prime Minister's office says instead of recalling the House, the government will simply stop collecting the tax until they can remove it altogether. Mike Lecouteur, CTV News, Ottawa.
And the federal Liberals are trying to get legislation aimed at addressing harmful behavior online passed for a third time. Canada's Justice Minister says the government has not decided whether to rewrite or simply reintroduce the Online Harms Act. It was originally brought forward last year, but it didn't pass. Measures addressing deepfakes and child exploitation are expected to be included in the legislation coming in the near future. The minister says some online harm measures could be included in a separate crime bill that's expected to be tabled sometime this fall. And as we see a surge of patriotism brought on by the current trade war made in Canada, merchandise is now selling fast. And right now, anything red and white is a hot commodity as people prepare for Canada Day tomorrow. Here's CTV's Camille Karamali on those showcasing their Canadian pride.
Block after block, house after house, one Canadian flag after another.
I think I just feel a lot of Canadian pride in general.
That pride, tough to miss leading up to Canada Day.
I'm happy to be Canadian and celebrate that.
Here in Edmonton, this neighborhood has one on every lawn.
People want to support their country.
And that has flag manufacturers and their machines working overtime.
This is the strongest year for flag sales by a considerable margin.
An Angus Reid poll found at the end of last year, 58% of those surveyed were either proud or very proud to be Canadian. But now in June, that surged to 67%.
What changed was just one thing. Donald Trump.
All in response to the U.S. president launching a trade war with Canada and wanting to make us America's 51st state.
Canadians, for the first time, I think, really became offensive in their nationalism.
That surge in Canadian pride also translating into big bucks for small local businesses. We're expected to see an even bigger increase come Canada Day.
Come with me.
Mira Staples sells vintage clothes. Almost all of them have this in common.
It's also made in Canada.
And there's never been a higher demand in her 3 decades of running the store.
They do more than before. Before, nobody really didn't care.
Nearly 40% of Canadian businesses say they've seen an increase in sales since the start of the trade war, especially in the retail, hospitality, and wholesale sectors. So whether people are buying Canadian or showcasing their pride on their porch,
we're more united this year.
One thing's for certain, it'll be a Canada Day unlike few have seen in their lifetime. Kamel Karamali, CTV News, Toronto.
And back here at home, the town of Poughkeepsie is hosting this year's Canada Day celebrations. It's a day full of activities is planned, and you won't want to miss it. It starts at 8 in the morning with a pancake breakfast at the Poughkeepsie Legion Hall. Then at 11, the annual Canada Day Parade leaves the village square. After the parade, the celebrations continue at McNabb Park. The activities include things like music, horse rides, food vendors, and much more. Unfortunately, however, there will be no fireworks this year due to the fire restrictions in place across the Peace region. All right, please do stay tuned. Noah Abel will be right back after the commercial with weather.